obviously to the 30 feet estimated by the Arkansas witnesses. And, his description of this thing, I mean, it was pretty close to what these Arkansas witnesses were describing. Now, I don't think that either of the Gary, Indiana witnesses mentioned any kind of tail. So I guess I don't really know what to, what to think of that necessarily. But outside of that, their description, was pretty comparable. They talked about this huge, dark-colored, featherless, pterosaur, for lack of a better word again. And it's of a similar size. So, but, speaking of those Gary, Indiana, sightings, yeah, I mean, it really struck me, again, how one of these things would have nowhere to hide. But then beyond that, we didn't get any other reports from people, either in this Arkansas case or from the Gary, Indiana cases yet. But it would be interesting to see if we ever do, of course, because I know at least specifically for that, the first Gary, Indiana sighting, I think for both of them, actually, there would have been other people on the road at that time. And, I asked them specifically, if they noticed anybody else's reaction. And they said that they didn't. But when you're driving along, I mean, it would be difficult, I think, to, while you're watching this giant thing or whatever, to sort of be looking at people in other cars and engaging their reaction. Because even the people who reported these sightings, like, they didn't pull over, And so the fact that, maybe nobody else did either,
Well, that, on the other hand, too, how many people are looking up in the sky when they're driving, too? Really? Yeah, if you got a couple passengers, they're bored and they're looking around at the sky, looking at things, looking at the trees, looking at the scenery. The driver usually keeps, at least I do, keeps the eye on the road. So I'm not really paying attention to what's going on in the sky. So, if somebody in the car goes, hey, look at that huge bird, then I'm going to look, I'm just kind of curious why they didn't pull over. And I would kind of be so interested if these bird reports or Terriago reports are if they made any sounds,
Now, for these ones specifically, nobody has reported any. But for the Arkansas or Gary sightings, like, neither one has reported any associated sounds. But there have been other reports of, large unidentified winged creatures. And the level of detail with those varies. Some of them, might be, potentially like a thunderbird or a pterosaur sort of sighting. Some of them might be closer to, say, like a flying humanoid or winged humanoid or Mothman sort of sighting. But people do sometimes describe this loud screeching noise. And there are a number of things that people will compare it to. The most common one being, some form of, like, vehicle brakes. I've had a guy compare it to, like, train brakes when a train's slowing down. Other people, like, maybe like your brakes when your brake pads are almost completely wore out. And so that's fairly consistent as far as the noise that, is ever really reported with these things, which I'll say, though, and people might not necessarily, enjoy this piece of information, but that is actually remarkably similar to the sound that, something like a great blue heron would make. So oftentimes what I've seen is with the sightings that describe that particular screeching sound, some of those, not necessarily all of them, but some of those do tend to be the sightings that I would be most likely to consider as potential, large bird misidentifications. So
interesting. Now, you mentioned before we went on the air a report of a humanoid creature that's been reported flying.
Oh yeah, no, that was an interesting case. This is another one that I haven't even published yet, but I will share it with you happily. So I was contacted by a witness who told me that back in September of 2003, he's from Springfield, Illinois, and he still lives there. And he was walking home, and there's this sort of shortcut through some woods there, basically. And there's a set of train tracks, and I guess apparently you're not really supposed to be walking along the tracks. And so he was being pretty cautious and sort of, looking out, because there were some houses sort of nearby this area where he was a little concerned. He didn't want anybody to call the police or hassle him or anything, just because he was taking this shortcut along these tracks or whatever. And so, he said that basically he's walking home. He's walking down these railroad tracks. And, it's around 10:30 p.m. He sees somebody in one of these houses that's relatively nearby pick up their phone or something. And again, this is back in, 2003. So it would have just been it was their house phone, basically. And, he got a little spooked. And so he goes further into these woods, just so he's more out of sight. And, he just kind of bummed around for a few minutes, maybe 30 minutes or so, and figured that, they didn't call the police or anything, so he's probably fine. So he's just going to go ahead and leave the woods and follow the tracks, all the way home. And he said he got about 50 feet from where he'd been hanging out in there. And he said he started hearing footsteps coming towards him in the leaves. And, he said these sounded like human footsteps.
Oh, boy, I'd be scared at that point.
Yeah, it was one of those things. This was later in our conversation. He mentioned how when he was a kid, because he grew up in this area too, when he was a kid, he and his friends would find these little wooden structures in these woods, down this one particular ravine, in this area, and they never saw anybody. He mentioned that specifically. He never saw any homeless people or anything hanging out in this area, although they always just kind of assumed that maybe that's who was making them. And so he thought maybe when he heard these footsteps right away that maybe, it was like a homeless guy or something, who knows? And so that got him a little nervous, understandably, because it's dark out. It's an encounter with a homeless person in the middle of the woods where nobody can see you. Probably is not something that, everybody would want to encounter at that time. And so he decides he's going to hide behind this tree. And he does. And he waits a few minutes, and he doesn't hear these footsteps anymore. And so he figures that they must have left. And he decides to go back sort of where he started, and then, continue on. And about 5 minutes into that, he has just the worst feeling. He's overcome by this feeling of abject terror. It's this feeling that, he's not supposed to be here, and that he needs to get out of here right now. And so, I mean, that's what he does. He takes off. He starts running. And he runs as fast as he can all the way to the outskirts of these woods. And that's when he notices that, he basically runs out and he gets out, and then he notices that the trees are sort of swaying and spinning in circles on the top, which he thought was really, really strange because there really wasn't anything to be making them do that. And he got this weird idea that, you know, maybe the trees were, you know, gonna grab him or something. And so, and that could have just been the fear at that point. You know, you get a lot of irrational thoughts when you start getting that scared, I think. But, you know, all of a sudden, he says the hair stood up on the back of his neck, and he just felt what he described as this sort of feeling of pure evil just directly behind him. And, you know, something in the back of his mind is telling him, you know, don't look back, you're not going to like what you see. But he ignores that, and he turns around. And he looks back, and he sees this creature on what he described as sort of a wheelless moped. And so what he said this thing looked like, he said that it looked to be a humanoid. So, you know, you've got this roughly human creature. He said it had long hair, was wearing, you know, bulky clothes, from what he could tell, and that it's flying this sort of like wheelless moped-looking vehicle thing. And it's right over the treetops, and it's moving parallel to where he's going, and it's completely silent. And so, you know, he doesn't stick around too long. Like, he sees this thing, and he just turns around and he takes off, and he runs away. I mean, you know, it seems like the sensible thing to do. And so a couple months after this, he's looking through a magazine at one of his friend's house, and in it, he sees this article about, you know, strange creatures, and he sees a picture of, you know, this flying humanoid from, I believe it was in Mexico. I think this was one of those, you know, a few years ago when people were seeing, you know, flying humanoids, you know, near Mexico City. And he sees this thing in this magazine, and he's like, oh my God, like that's what I saw. That's exactly what I saw. And, you know, so he sends me that picture. And yeah, I mean, that was his story. You know, I got him to write it out for me, and then, you know, then I called him and I talked to him on the phone for at least an hour. And, yeah, he seemed like a normal, you know, just like a normal guy trying to make sense of his experience. And so, you know, this was an interesting one to me, especially because, you know, he had a few sort of not added details, but there were a couple of things that were interesting that came out after, you know, I spoke to him. You know, he talked to me about how he went back sometime later, and, you know, because he waited a while, but he needed to go check that spot out, you know, during the daytime. He was pretty clear that he didn't ever want to set foot in those woods after dark again.
I wouldn't.
Right. And he goes back during the daytime, and he goes and he finds the exact, you know, hill he was on, that where there is this ravine, and, you know, he knows where this tree was supposed to be, because this is an area, again, that he knows pretty well. He's been coming here since he was a kid. And he said, you know, I couldn't find the tree that I hid behind. It just wasn't there. You know, he's like, and there's no way that it could have fallen down into the ravine or anything else, you know, because he looked to make sure that, like, it hadn't been uprooted somehow or, like, fallen into the ravine through some other, like, through some method, you know. And he was sure, you know. And so, like, that was just a little bit of added, you know, weirdness on top of his already incredibly highly strange encounter with whatever that was. And
Did it? Now, I got to ask you a question. Did he say how big it was, or did it have any weird smells, or did it make any weird noises or anything?